Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
It's good to be back.
You know, this time you sent us some really interesting stuff looking at China and Taiwan and specifically how they each approach culture and identity.
Yeah. You know, it's pretty wild how different they are.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like night and day, totally different playbooks.
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. It's the super fascinating contrast, right? Like, on one hand, we have Taiwan, and they seem to be making a really conscious effort to embrace all sorts of different cultural identities.
Yeah.
And then you have mainland China, where it seems like they're pushing really hard for just one unified culture. And some of the sources even use terms like assimilation when they talk about how China treats its minority cultures.
Yeah, bundling culture is something that pops up a lot in the research, and it seems to be causing some real tension.
Exactly. So what we're going to do today is dig into these different approaches, try to understand the ideas behind them, and see how they actually play out in the lives of people living in both places.
And we've got a ton of great material to work with.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, research papers, articles on language policies, discussions on minority cultures, and even some legal stuff that kind of had my eyebrows raised.
Oh, yeah. Some of that was dense.
Yeah. But it's super important stuff. We're going to unpack it all.
Absolutely.
So buckle up, everyone. This is going to be a deep dive into the world of cultural policies in China and Taiwan.
It's a big topic.
Yeah. But we'll break it down, make it feel like we're just chatting about something really interesting over coffee.
Exactly. And we'll use everything you sent to understand not just the differences in policy, but the whole philosophy behind them.
Yeah. And what it means for the people who live there, you know.
For sure.
All right. Let's get started. So, Taiwan first. What really struck me was how diverse the cultural scene sounds over there. Like, you've got Han Chinese, indigenous cultures, Japanese influence from their time ruling Taiwan.
Yeah.
Even a bit of Western influence. It's a real melting pot. And it sounds like they're not just letting these things exist side by side, but they're actually going out of their way to support them, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Taiwan's cultural landscape is super diverse, and their policies really do seem to be all about supporting that multiculturalism. Like, a great example is their approach to language.
Right, that Indigenous Languages Development Act from 2017. That sounded like a pretty big deal.
Oh, yeah, it's huge. I mean, this act made 16 indigenous languages official national languages. And what's really interesting here is how proactive Taiwan is being. They're not just tolerating these languages, they're actually putting resources into reviving them, bringing them back to life.
And I think that speaks volumes about how they're defining their national identity, right? Like, it's not just one single culture. It's a tapestry of many.
Exactly. It's a more inclusive approach and not just symbolic. I mean, there are actual budget allocations to support their preservation and revitalization.
Oh, wow. So it's not just talk. There's real money being put behind this effort. So how does that actually play out in real life?
So, like, the Ministry of Education has this whole online platform just for indigenous languages.
Wow.
And then schools all over Taiwan are offering courses in these languages.
That's amazing. So it's not just lip service. They're actually creating resources to make these languages accessible, to keep them alive.
Exactly. And it's not just about indigenous languages either. They're also supporting Taiwanese and Hakka languages too.
Right. I remember reading about that. So what are they doing specifically?
So they're providing funding for things like publishing and broadcasting in both Taiwanese, which is also known as Minnan, and in Hakka.
Okay.
You'll even see bilingual education programs popping up in different areas. It's like they're really working to ensure that these languages don't fade away.
That's really impressive. They're putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah,
so they're backing up these languages with resources, which is crucial. But what about the culture itself? Are there any specific ways that Taiwan promotes and celebrates that broader cultural diversity we talked about?
Yeah, tons. Taiwan's got this really vibrant festival scene that truly showcases all those different cultures.
Oh, cool. Like what?
Well, like, you've got festivals that celebrate indigenous cultures, such as the Amaz's Illicin Harvest Festival.
Okay.
I read a bit about it. It sounds amazing. It's a huge celebration of their community and the harvest.
Very cool.
And then you have events like the Yunlin International Puppet Theater Festival, which focuses on a local art form, but also brings in artists from all over the world.
Wait, a puppet festival? That sounds so cool. I wouldn't have expected that, but it's such a unique way to keep traditions alive.
It totally is. It's another way Taiwan blends its own unique traditions with influences from all over the world.
Love that.
And looking ahead, there's this planned National Museum of Indigenous Peoples, which is set to open in 2027.
Yeah.
That's going to be huge. They're even planning to incorporate indigenous languages into the exhibitions themselves, which is a major statement about their commitment to showcasing these cultures authentically.
A whole national museum dedicated to indigenous people using their own languages. That's some serious dedication. It goes beyond just showcasing culture. It's about truly giving them a platform.
Exactly. And this commitment is reflected in their government policies as well.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, like they've established this Indigenous Historical Justice and Transitional Justice Committee.
Okay.
It's all about acknowledging the injustices of the past, taking steps towards reconciliation, making sure that their history is told in a way that includes everyone.
Yeah, that's really important. Actually taking steps to address the past shows real commitment.
It does. And you see this reflected in things like the inclusion of indigenous language courses in schools and these amazing community-led language revival programs.
Right.
Like there are groups like the Pingpu who are doing incredible work to bring back their ancestral languages.
That's amazing.
It's truly inspiring. And even on a national level, President Tsai Ing-wen's apology in 2016 for the historical oppression of indigenous peoples, and then the 5-fold increase in funding for language programs the very next year, that speaks volumes.
Totally. So when you look at Taiwan, you get this feeling that they're saying, hey, all these different cultures, all these different threads make up who we are. It's what makes us strong. It's not about one dominant culture pushing everyone else aside.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Thanks. It captures the essence of their approach, I think.
It really does. Now, shifting gears, let's talk about mainland China.
Okay.
The picture we get from the sources you provided is, well, in many ways, the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's stark. We talked about bundling culture earlier, and it seems to be at the heart of this. Like, they're really emphasizing one unified national culture.
Right.
And there are some serious concerns about what this means for minority cultures like the Uyghurs, Tibetans, who are being kind of absorbed into this Han majority.
That is the core issue. While officially China recognizes a lot of different ethnic groups, the reality on the ground, as documented in so many of these sources, seems to be quite different.
Right.
There's a real push for a more singular cultural identity rooted in Han Chinese culture and really intertwined with the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about the Uyghurs first, because some of what I read was truly concerning. Restricting their language, destruction of mosques.
Yeah, it's deeply troubling. I mean, multiple sources detail these very severe restrictions on using the Uyghur language.
Right.
Not only in schools, but just in everyday life.
Wow.
And then on top of that, there are these credible reports and satellite images that show the widespread destruction of places that are deeply meaningful to Uyghur culture.
Right, like their history and identity.
Exactly. We're talking mosques, shrines, even cemeteries. It's a huge loss.
And what about this pairing assistance program I read about?
Yeah.
That sounded really strange, like something straight out of a dystopian novel.
I know. This program basically involves sending Han Chinese officials to live with Uyghur families.
Live with them?
Yeah, live with them to monitor them.
Oh, wow.
And the stated goal is to promote unity, provide support, and help with economic development.
Okay.
But a lot of observers are worried that these officials are basically acting as a form of surveillance, keeping a close eye on these families,
Right.
making sure they're not practicing their own culture or religion too openly.
Wow. So essentially dictating how they should live their lives, even within their own homes.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are the re-education camps.
Yeah, the elephant in the room. The numbers I saw suggested over 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in these camps.
That's right. The Chinese government calls them vocational training centers. They say they're for combating extremism and poverty.
Okay.
But these places have been heavily criticized by the international community because of the conditions there and how the detainees are treated.
And the accusations are incredibly serious: genocide, crimes against humanity. These are not words to be thrown around lightly.
Absolutely not. The U.S. government, the UK government, and various UN bodies have expressed extreme concern over what's happening.
Right.
And some officials and human rights organizations have even said that what's happening in Xinjiang amounts to genocide and crimes against humanity because of the evidence of things like forced sterilization, forced labor, and the systematic effort to wipe out Uyghur culture.
Wow.
It's a very serious situation.
It really is. Now, moving on to Tibet, it seems like there's a similar kind of dynamic at play with this policy of sinicization.
You're right. It does seem like a similar dynamic is at play.
Could you break down what sinicization means in this context for those who might not be familiar with the term?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, sinicization in this context means pushing non-Han groups to adopt Han Chinese culture, their language, customs, and even political ideology.
Wow.
And this is often actively encouraged or in some cases even enforced by the state. And in Tibet, this is happening in a very real and deliberate way. For example, they're actively encouraging Han Chinese people to migrate to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, which has significantly shifted the demographics in many areas.
Okay, so there's a deliberate attempt to change the makeup of the population, which would inevitably have a huge impact on local culture, right?
Exactly.
So it's not just about individuals choosing to move there. It's a strategic move by the government.
Right. It is very much a strategic move by the government.
Yep.
And in the education system, Mandarin Chinese is pushed really hard.
True.
It's often the primary language of instruction, and this often comes at the expense of teaching the Tibetan language.
Right.
And then you also see a lot of promotion of Han Chinese art forms and cultural practices and historical narratives, which sometimes overshadow and push aside Tibetan traditions.
So they're basically saying this is the dominant culture and you need to learn it and adopt it.
Essentially, yes. And this is happening at all levels of society. I remember you sent something about boarding schools in Tibet, right?
Yes. I was really struck by that.
Yeah, so UN experts have been sounding the alarm about this for a while.
Okay.
There are reports that almost 1 million Tibetan children are being sent to these state-run boarding schools.
1 million children?
It's a staggering number. And the big worry is that these schools, which are often located far from the kids' families and communities, mainly use Mandarin as the language of instruction.
Right.
And they teach a curriculum that's heavily focused on Chinese culture and national identity.
So essentially separating children from their cultural roots at a young age and immersing them in Han culture. It's like a forced assimilation tactic.
That is the concern, and it's a major one.
Yeah.
The Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile have called this cultural genocide, you know?
Yeah.
They see it as a systematic attempt to destroy the Tibetan way of life.
It's devastating.
Of course, China has a very different story.
Okay.
They say all of this is about improving economic conditions, modernizing the region, and bringing development to Tibet.
But even if their intentions are good, the impact is still really damaging to Tibetan culture.
Yeah, the impact is definitely a major concern.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative? We saw that Xinjiang is a key part of that plan. Does that have any implications for Uyghur culture?
It's hard to say for sure, but it probably does.
Okay.
Because of where Xinjiang is, it's this crucial link between China and Central Asia in the Belt and Road.
Right.
And because of this, China's focus on the region is intensifying for both economic and strategic reasons.
Yeah.
And this could lead to even tighter control over Uyghur culture, all in the name of stability and making sure the Belt and Road project goes smoothly.
Right. And in doing so, further marginalizing their distinct identity. It's like they're saying, we need your land for this project, so you need to fall in line.
It's definitely a concern, and it highlights a stark contrast with Taiwan, right?
Absolutely. It's such a different picture in Taiwan. They're all about celebrating and supporting diversity.
Totally.
And China seems to be pushing for this one-size-fits-all cultural approach, which is putting a lot of pressure on minority groups to conform.
That's the key difference. And it gets even more interesting when we look at how these approaches to culture play into the whole question of identity, particularly in the relationship between China and Taiwan.
Right, because the way Taiwan is actively promoting its own languages and celebrating its unique cultural mix must be seen differently from Beijing's point of view.
Exactly. From Beijing's perspective, Taiwan developing its own distinct identity, especially when it emphasizes languages and customs that set it apart from mainland China, could be seen as moving away from a shared Chinese identity.
And of course, this is all tangled up with China's territorial claims on Taiwan and their strong opposition to any move towards Taiwanese independence.
Exactly. It's not just about culture for Beijing, it's about national unity. They see a separate Taiwanese culture as a threat to their goal of unification.
So for them, a strong, distinct Taiwanese identity is a problem.
It seems that way. But from Taiwan's perspective, that same diversity using Taiwanese, Hakka, and indigenous languages is seen as a really important part of being Taiwanese.
Right. It reflects their history, their unique journey.
It does. And this difference in how they see themselves is really evident in the data. Like, there was a Pew Research Center survey in 2023 that showed that 67% of people in Taiwan primarily identify as Taiwanese.
Wow.
And only 3% see themselves primarily as Chinese.
Okay. So that's a massive gap in how people in Taiwan perceive their own identity.
It really is, and you see this reflected in their education policies, too.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, remember how we discussed that Taiwan is actively promoting the teaching of Taiwanese and Hakka languages in schools?
Yeah.
Well, in mainland China, Mandarin is dominant, particularly in areas with large minority populations.
Right. So it highlights how language can become a symbol.
Totally.
It goes beyond just communication. It's a way of expressing who you are and where you belong.
Exactly. And this leads us to something really important. How China is trying to limit what you call Taiwan independence as a fact.
Right. Because practically speaking, Taiwan functions as an independent country, right?
Right.
It has its own government, military, currency, everything.
That's right.
It governs itself, makes its own laws.
Exactly. It even has its own constitution and courts, handles its own foreign affairs. It's operating as a fully independent entity.
But as with most things between China and Taiwan, there are very different interpretations of what this means.
For sure. From Taiwan's point of view, this state of affairs, having their own constitution, independent courts, and managing their own relationships with other countries, this is independence in action.
Yeah.
But China insists that Taiwan is a part of their territory, a province that must be reunified with the mainland.
Right. And that they'll use force if necessary to make it happen.
That's right. And then you have the rest of the world trying to navigate this situation. Most countries have this one China policy, which basically acknowledges China's claim without necessarily agreeing with it.
Right. It's this weird diplomatic dance.
It is. It's a unique situation where Taiwan acts like an independent country but doesn't have full recognition from a lot of other countries.
So how is China trying to push back against this reality of Taiwan's independence? The stuff you sent me talked about some pretty serious measures they're taking.
Yeah, it's a multi-pronged approach. They're using legal and judicial tactics, military and diplomatic pressure, economic and social maneuvering, information control, and even psychological tactics to try to influence people's thinking.
Wow, they're really pulling out all the stops.
They are. Let's start with the legal and judicial measures, because those new guidelines they issued in June 2024, where they can now hold trials in absentia for people who support Taiwan independence, those are a big escalation.
Yeah, like what does that even mean? Trials in absentia.
Basically, it means that mainland Chinese courts can now try individuals even if they aren't physically present in mainland China.
So they can put someone on trial even if that person is in Taiwan or another country.
Exactly. And it could even apply to foreign nationals, anyone they accuse of supporting Taiwan independence.
So a Taiwanese politician in Taipei who speaks out for independence could face charges from Beijing?
Exactly. It sends a chilling message.
And what about the punishments?
The punishments are really serious. Fines, imprisonment, and in some cases, even the death penalty.
The death penalty, that's intense. But how can they actually enforce this? Like, can China really make other countries hand over people they accuse of supporting Taiwan independence?
That's the tricky part.
Yeah.
Trying to enforce these legal decisions in other countries, especially democratic ones with their own independent courts, is going to be really complicated.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine many countries going along with that.
Exactly. But regardless of how enforceable these laws are, they create a real threat, right? It's meant to scare people, to make them think twice before speaking out for Taiwan's independence.
Makes sense. It's a psychological tactic as much as a legal one.
Exactly. Now, what about the military and diplomatic pressure? We hear a lot about that in the news.
Yeah, it seems like China is always flexing its military muscle around Taiwan.
It is definitely a constant element of their strategy. They're constantly conducting these large-scale military exercises in the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah.
And then they send their military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense zone.
So basically trying to intimidate them.
Right. They're sending a clear message. Don't mess with us.
Okay.
They're also testing Taiwan's defenses and seeing how the international community reacts.
So, bit of a chess game. Testing the waters and seeing how far they can push things.
Yeah.
And what about diplomacy? I remember reading about how China is trying to isolate Taiwan on the world stage?
Yeah, that's a key part of their strategy. They're constantly working to convince countries to cut ties with Taiwan and recognize Beijing instead. And it's working.
Yeah.
Fewer and fewer countries have formal relations with Taiwan. Like earlier this year, Nauru switched their recognition to China.
So Taiwan is becoming more and more isolated internationally.
That's right. China is really squeezing them from all sides.
It sounds like they're putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan, both militarily and diplomatically. What about economic and social pressure? What are they doing on that front?
Okay, so economically, Taiwan and mainland China are really interconnected.
Yeah, their economies are pretty intertwined, right?
Right. China is Taiwan's biggest trading partner. So China uses this to their advantage.
Right.
They use things like economic sanctions, like the ban on certain Taiwanese agricultural products they put in place a while back.
Right.
But they also offer incentives like special policies to encourage Taiwanese businesses to invest in mainland China.
Okay.
They want to make Taiwan more dependent on them, which could then lead to political influence down the line.
So it's like dangling a carrot while holding a stick.
Exactly.
What about the social aspect?
Okay, so this is where China uses united front tactics.
United front. What's that?
So basically, they try to build relationships with and support people and organizations in Taiwan that are sympathetic to China's goals. This includes media outlets, political parties, even individual influencers. They're trying to cultivate pro-China voices within Taiwan itself.
Wow. It's a very subtle and strategic approach. So they're using economic leverage, creating social pressure, and trying to win hearts and minds within Taiwan.
Yeah, it's a multi-layered strategy.
And then there's the whole information and propaganda side of things.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
China is known for controlling information within its own borders, right?
They are. Inside China, any information about Taiwan that doesn't align with the government's official line is very strictly censored.
Right, the Great Firewall and all that.
Exactly. They block websites, control the media, and heavily monitor what people are saying online. And their official narrative, which is that Taiwan is a part of China, full stop, is everywhere.
Oh.
You see it in the state-controlled media, you hear it in schools, it's all pervasive.
So they're really shaping the narrative within China. But what about internationally?
Internationally, they're pushing that same narrative. They're investing a lot in trying to shape the global conversation about Taiwan.
And then there's the cultural assimilation piece.
Oh, right. This is where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit insidious.
How so?
Well, it's all about trying to blur the lines between Taiwanese and Chinese identity.
Okay.
They do this by emphasizing historical and cultural links, pushing this idea of one family across the strait.
I see.
You'll see things like government-sponsored exchange programs, special treatment for Taiwanese people who move to China.
So they're making it attractive for Taiwanese people to integrate into mainland society.
Exactly. It's all very strategic.
But it sounds like China faces some serious challenges with this approach, right?
They do.
I mean, Taiwan seems pretty determined to chart its own course.
Right. I mean, despite all these efforts, China has some serious obstacles to overcome. Like, remember how we talked about that Pew Research data?
Yeah.
How most people in Taiwan identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese?
Yep.
Well, that's a big hurdle for China.
It's like they can try to control the narrative all they want, but people have their own experiences, their own sense of identity, and those aren't so easily swayed.
Exactly. And then you have the international factor.
Right, countries like the U.S. supporting Taiwan.
Exactly. They provide Taiwan with weapons and political support.
And then there's the internet, right?
Yes. Even with the Great Firewall, information still gets through. People in China can still find alternative viewpoints if they know where to look.
Right. So it's this constant push and pull, China trying to control the narrative, Taiwan asserting its own identity, and the international community trying to figure out where they stand.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and it all ties back to our core discussion today. These totally opposite cultural policies, their impact on how people see themselves, and this constant struggle over Taiwan's independence.
It really is like two different worlds colliding. So let's recap.
Okay.
We talked about how Taiwan is embracing multiculturalism, taking real steps to protect its diverse languages and cultures.
Right.
And then we contrasted that with mainland China's push for a unified national identity, which has led to a lot of concern about the treatment of minority cultures.
Right, and there are those accusations about cultural assimilation, which are very serious.
Yeah, and we can't forget about China's constant pressure on Taiwan, using everything from legal threats to military exercises to economic incentives to try to undermine their independence. It's a complex situation, and it seems like these two societies are on very different paths.
Absolutely. Taiwan is making it very clear that they value their diversity and they're committed to protecting it.
Yeah.
While China is focused on control and uniformity, even if it means suppressing dissenting voices and pushing minority groups to conform.
And we saw some very concrete examples of this, right? Like in Tibet, where they banned monks from teaching Tibetan language informally.
Yes. And in 2019, they made it mandatory for schools in Tibet to teach all subjects in Mandarin except for first-grade Tibetan.
And let's not forget about sending Tibetan kids to boarding schools far from home, where they're immersed in Han Chinese culture and language. That's a pretty aggressive way of trying to erase someone's cultural identity, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely a very controversial policy with significant implications.
Yeah. And it's important to acknowledge the human costs of these policies.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get caught up in the big political picture, but it's the individuals, the families, the communities who are most affected.
That's so important to remember.
But it's not a completely black and white picture, right? Like, even in Taiwan, where they embrace multiculturalism, there's still this recognition of their shared history with mainland China. I mean, there was that poll from 2019 that showed that over 80% of Taiwanese people still identify Chinese culture as a basis for their own culture.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's not just one culture completely rejecting the other. There are these shared roots, these intertwined histories that can't be ignored.
Right. And even with those shared roots, it's clear that Taiwan and China are going about things very differently. They have different values, different priorities, and those are playing out in their cultural policies and their approaches to identity.
You're absolutely right. It's like they're two sides of the same coin, but with very different engravings.
Love that analogy. And it's so important to consider the human element in all of this.
Absolutely.
Like, what's it actually like for a Taiwanese person to live in mainland China? What kind of challenges do they face?
It's a great question, and it's something we need to talk about.
Yeah. So what are some of the specific hurdles they might encounter?
Well, for starters, there's the hukou system.
The hukou system, remind me what that is.
It's basically China's household registration system.
Okay.
And it ties things like access to education and healthcare to where you're from. So for a Taiwanese person, that can be a big barrier.
So it's not just about moving there. It's about being accepted as a full member of society.
Right. It creates this whole other layer of complexity. And then there's the education system itself.
Yeah.
The curriculum is different, and their academic qualifications from Taiwan might not be recognized.
So it's not a seamless transition, educationally speaking.
It's not. And then, of course, there's the political education that's required in Chinese universities.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, that can be a real adjustment for someone coming from Taiwan, where the academic environment is much more open.
Yeah.
And then there's the political climate in general.
Right. Like, how much freedom do they have to express their political views, especially regarding Taiwan's independence?
Well, not much.
It's China.
Exactly. They can't vote or hold office in mainland China.
Right.
And there's a lot of surveillance, a lot of sensitivity around anything that could be seen as supporting Taiwan independence.
So they're constantly walking on eggshells, politically speaking.
It's not an easy environment for a Taiwanese person who might have different views.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they're living in a system where they have limited rights and have to be really careful about what they say.
Right.
But what about everyday life? Expressing themselves culturally, practicing their customs, things like that.
That can be tricky, too.
Okay.
I mean, you've got the censorship in China.
Right.
So they might not be able to access the same information or express themselves as freely as they could back in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And then there are these social pressures to conform, you know, to support unification, to adopt mainland cultural norms.